Chapter 3. Mothers are special. At the beginning of 1974, I realised it was time for me to change the flow of my river and return to my family in Australia. After all, the overseas trip, which was originally planned for 2 years, had ended up lasting more than 4. At the time, I was living in London with my boyfriend. With a little nudge, he decided to join me on the journey back to Australia. We flew to Melbourne via Sydney, where we stopped over to stay with our friend Victor, who had flown home 3 months earlier. During our fleeting visit, we took in the sights with ferry rides to Manly and Luna Park, Sunday brunch at a seafood cafe, and evening walks to a restaurant or pub in Mosman or Cremorne. A week later, we arrived at my family home, without having given any definite arrival details. Sometime before Christmas, I'd said. Knocking on the front door of the family home, I was so excited. Then my mother opened the door. Mum was approximately 172 centimetres tall, short black hair, olive complexion, and greeted me with a surprised, albeit excited, smile on her face. "Oh, Lynn," she screamed, "wow, I wasn't expecting you this early." She opened the door and we threw our arms around each other, without comprehending that the screen door had closed in my boyfriend's face. Suddenly realising he wasn't behind me, the door was reopened to introduce my mother to the man I loved. A young man walked over and said hello, but my recognition was blank and promptly thought he might be a neighbour. It was my brother Josh, much taller than when I left, dark brown short hair, beautiful blue eyes like our father, a warm smile, and a height of 177 centimetres, which is what Siri said. I felt so embarrassed. "I'm sorry, Josh. You've changed so much I didn't recognise you." Josh was very understanding and laughed with that friendly smile of his. Realising later my change in weight from eating those fish and chips after many late nights out in London could have given him a fright. My brother Brendan's facial features were exactly the same, with short fair hair, except a little older and taller. We also hugged as I introduced my man to everyone. My baby brother Ashley was only 6 and didn't recognise me. He was very cute, with light brown hair and a little shy, hiding behind Mum's dress. "You remember all those letters I read out to you?" Mum asked. "This is your sister Lynn. She wrote those letters." Arriving home after a long day working, my father was so excited, running around like a rooster with its head chopped off. Dad had the most beautiful piercing blue eyes and not much taller than Mum, although strong and proud. He just had to go to the bottle shop and buy some booze for the fun and celebration which was the night's agenda. We stayed at the family home for 2 weeks until we found an apartment in Prahran. My father suffered a breakdown in January 1975 when he was diagnosed as a manic depressive. This disease was relatively new in the 70s. It has since been renamed bipolar. During this time, the whole family was worried about my father, without realising the effect his illness was having on Mum. My mother always went about her business in private and no one knew she was stressed. She had a knack for not showing it. My mother had a cerebral hemorrhage and died on the 24th of September 1975. Years later, when I was receiving a healing, my spirit guide said, "Your mother was worn out, and that was why she died." Mum suffered asthma and bronchitis most of her life. She gave birth to 7 children, one of whom died, and suffered 2 miscarriages. A week before my mother died, my boyfriend and I were walking down our street with shopping bags in our hands, as I caught a glimpse of someone further down the road, which looked like my mother. I shouted, "Mum, is that you?" She turned around and sure enough, it was my mother. It was out of character for her to visit. On Saturdays, Dad usually went to the footy to watch Richmond, Aussie Rules, the Mighty Tigers, with my younger brothers, repeating the tradition once earmarked to the older sisters. On this particular day, Mum decided to visit us and asked Dad to drop her off on his way to the football. Once all the food from our shopping was put away, the 3 of us proceeded to walk across the road from our apartment to a little pub never visited. The afternoon was spent reminiscing about my childhood and travels overseas. Mum thought the younger generation's concept of living together before marriage was worth pursuing. I would have liked to live with your father before we married. It was only 9 months since returning from overseas, and this visit with my mother was the beginning of our getting to know each other again. I was really pleased we hadn't missed her and treasured this time, albeit a short encounter. A few hours later, Dad returned to collect Mum. I hugged her, not knowing that would be the last time I'd see her. On Monday the 21st of September, a letter arrived in the mail with a $100 cheque from the Melbourne Cup lottery, plus a ticket with a horse's name in the biggest race of the year. This meant if my horse won in the Melbourne Cup, there would be a large sum of money to collect. Picking up the phone and dialing the number to tell my mother about the news, there was hesitation in my voice as my father answered. Hi Dad. Is Mum busy? Dad said, yes, she's in the kitchen at the moment. The excitement was running through my veins and I blurted out my news to him. Dad, I've won $100 and also a ticket with a horse in the Melbourne Cup, which means there is a big chance to win again if my horse comes in. He promised to pass my news on to Mum. We talked for a while about his work and then I said goodbye. I never spoke to my mother again. The 24th of September was show day in Melbourne and a public holiday. This public holiday had since been changed. My boyfriend and I thought about visiting my parents, and although it was tempting, we opted for a lazy day together. That evening there was a knock on the front door, and it was my father, looking very upset. He entered the apartment and I promptly poured a brandy with the intention of calming him down. He said, I came home from work and found your mother in bed, foaming at the mouth. I talked to the doctor on the phone and he advised me to ring the ambulance to take her to the hospital. Once we reached the hospital, I was asked to leave. Knowing you live a few streets away, I thought I'd come here. Very shortly after drinking his brandy, he insisted on going back to the hospital, promising his return. Just after my father left, walking into my bedroom, an overwhelming feeling hit me that my mother would not survive. I believe she died at that moment. The tears welled up in my eyes as I paced up and down the bedroom in disbelief. It seemed like moments later, although it was at least half an hour, when I was interrupted by my father's return. My father and auntie stood at the door. Opening the door, I cried out, "She's dead, isn't she?" My auntie said, "How did you know?" "We just left the hospital." I ushered them both in and gave my father another brandy while we deciphered what to do and how to contact the rest of the family. My sister Maureen was working that day, and after consulting her superior, we drove to East Bentley, feeling traumatised by the emotional reaction we all knew was about to play out. Upon our arrival, my father greeted her with the sad news, and of course she was extremely upset. I climbed out of the car to comfort her. Mum and Maureen were very close, especially since Sue and I travelled overseas. Eventually climbing back into the car, I comforted my little sister during the drive home, where my brothers Ashley and Brendan were waiting, unaware of the tragedy. My little brother Ashley was only 6 years old. Suddenly I knew his birth was meant to be, even though my mother struggled with the idea of having a child at 39. Ashley would be there to help my father through this difficult time. Dad would be the sole parent. Where was Josh? The family sat in the kitchen waiting for him. Finally he arrived home around 10:30 p.m. He'd been home all day with Mum and around 3 p.m. left to catch up with friends on her insistence. "Go out with your friends because your father will be home shortly. I'll just lie down for a while as I have a headache." It was a terrible time. My mother was only 46. All my plans for us to become reacquainted vanished, as now it was too late. A few days later, during the church service of her funeral, seated in the front row between Josh and Brendan, brought tears to my eyes, witnessing their sadness. Wrapping my arms around their shoulders to comfort them, the mother instinct greeted me. A few days later, entangled in a delayed reaction of sobbing in my boyfriend's arms, shock permeated throughout my body, and in turn I succumbed to the flu, which lasted many weeks. In retrospect, my mother visiting me the week before she died was not a coincidence. Besides, I don't believe in coincidence, as I believe certain events occur like a domino effect for each of us to learn. Plus, deciding not to visit the family home and Josh going out with his mates, subconsciously or consciously, my mother knew she was going to die and she needed to be alone. After my mother died, her spirit watched over me, so various people led me to believe. At that time in my life, I was oblivious to what they really meant and shrugged my shoulders, not really understanding the significance of their words, but listening anyway. This waterfall of life shook my heart and sent it spiralling deep into the water below, causing emotional turmoil and disbelief, unable to surface to the mind of understanding. Eventually, with time, the cascade starts to flow over a rocky surface. The river turned into a huge rapid of unknown emotional turmoil.